Alright, so it's December, and once again everybody is thinking about the fact that Christmas was once the ancient Roman festival of the Saturnalia. Or at least that's what I'm thinking about. I don't know if that's what you think about too. I'm incredibly interested in ancient Roman religion. In fact, I wrote my entire PhD thesis about paganism and what happened to it in late antiquity. What I find so interesting about this topic is that whenever I tell people what I study, they will always have a new story for me about something that they've heard is Christian now but once used to be pagan. In fact, this one time I went on a date with a guy and I told him what I studied, that I was looking at the end of paganism, and he just pulled out his phone and he showed me this clip from The Simpsons.
Oh, what noble visionary thought up April Fool's Day.
Like Halloween and Christmas, April Fool's Day traces its origins to pagan ritual.
God bless those pagans.
April 1st used to be the pagan New Year.
Blood for Baal! Blood for Baal! Blood for Baal!
The Christians changed their calendar and ridiculed those who didn't.
Happy New Year!
Hi-ho, pagans! New Year's was 3 months ago, but here's a present anywho.
It's ram's blood for your godless ceremony.
April Fools!
Now who's laughing? Now who's laughing?
The man who showed me that clip is now my husband. So I really like this clip, not so much for the historical accuracy. After all, I don't believe that April Fool's Day has its origins in the worship of the Syrian and Levantine god Baal. On the other hand, I do think that this really successfully captures the dominant narrative in popular culture right now about what paganism is and how it has survived into the present day. You can see that it really captures pagans as these bloodthirsty, barbaric, backwards kind of people. They are dancing around a fire, they're conducting human sacrifices, and they're kind of mad and ecstatic during the whole process. We also have this idea that these pagan rituals survived down to the present day via mostly Christian holidays that have slowly become secularized in recent centuries. And I find this interesting, but I also find it so different from the reality that I was studying every day as a researcher looking at paganism in late antiquity in particular. I wasn't looking so much at evidence of human sacrifice or even of animal sacrifice. Most of what I was seeing was pretty mundane, but also much more relatable. I was looking at evidence of ordinary everyday rituals, things like lighting a lamp, or making a donation of some incense, or perhaps donating a coin or some fruits or a basket of grain, or things that were really small. And some of these things might even be considered acceptable in a lot of religions today, including in Christianity. So even though you might see some of this behavior in churches or in temples today, we've kind of drawn a really arbitrary line between these two traditions. In fact, it might surprise you to know that there is no universally academically agreed definition of what paganism is. In fact, this is one of the most controversial topics in ancient Roman studies. So in order to really say, hey, this Christian tradition has its origins in ancient Roman paganism, we have to kind of have a clear idea of what paganism is in the first place. And this ambiguity has real implications for today. I'm sure you remember in 2023 when King Charles was crowned, he issues invitations to his coronation with an image of a decorative figure known as the Green Man. Even though this figure appears on church decorations all over England, people on Twitter were very quick to label this figure pagan, and naturally to be outraged about it. In fact, the evidence that the Green Man was ever once worshipped as a god is actually pretty scant. But that didn't stop people from finding it suspiciously close to what they called paganism. So why is it so difficult to tell if something is pagan or not? Well, I believe the problem stems from the word's immensely complicated history. So in this video, I want to properly investigate this. First of all, I want to ask where the word paganism comes from. Then I want to ask, how did we end up with so many parts of our modern world, and indeed of Christianity in particular, which are said to have their origins in paganism. Finally, I want to come to some conclusions about whether or not paganism is a useful or even helpful way of thinking about the ancient Romans and the various religious traditions that they had. So lock in for a deep dive into what is paganism And is it still around in Christian and non-Christian traditions today? It was an autumn evening in the Sicilian town of Catania early in the 4th century AD, when a Christian priest was urgently summoned to the house of the governor of the province, a man named Zoilus. When this priest arrived, he must have found Zoilus in deep, deep distress. His 18-month-old daughter, Julia, was fast succumbing to a life-threatening illness. At the parents' request, the priest baptized the infant girl on the spot, and 4 hours later, she passed away. Julia's grief-stricken parents buried her in front of the church of St. Agatha. The parents of Julia Florentina commemorated her passing with an inscription which can now be found in the Louvre Museum. The inscription tells us that she was the sweetest and most innocent girl, but it also describes her as having been born a pagan. Then it goes on to say that she was made one of the faithful mere hours before passing. Scholar Alan Cameron has argued that Julia Florentina was the first person to ever be described as a pagan in the religious sense of the word. And this usage was a world away from the negative pagan stereotypes that we have seen today. Clearly, her parents meant nothing negative or harmful in using the word pagan to describe their daughter. So clearly there's something else going on in the use of the word pagan. This inscription was made only a few years after the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the year 312 AD. After this event, the political tides had turned, and more people were converting to Christianity. At the same time, Christians were inventing new words to describe the line between themselves and traditional Roman religions that they wanted to be seen as separate from. Before this inscription was reinterpreted by Alan Cameron, many people argued that the word pagan was something of an insult. Garth Fowden, for example, argued that the word paganus was derived from the Latin word for village, or pagus, which basically meant that calling someone a pagan was like calling them a country hick or a hillbilly. But in the case of Julia Florentina and the very tender epitaph that her parents wrote for her, I simply don't think it's possible that they meant the word pagan in a pejorative way. Cameron has argued that the more appropriate way to translate the word paganus would be as a civilian. But even though the word paganism and its many other related terms was not necessarily derogatory, it very quickly became so. And even if we as modern people choose to use the word pagan and we're not choosing to do so in a derogatory way, some historians have argued that even using the word means that we're taking an inherently Christian perspective. Historian Garth Fowden argues, Christians call the cult of the old gods paganism, that is, rusticity, not just because the expression was derogatory, but also because it was such a convenient shorthand for this vast spectrum of cults, ranging from the international to the ethnic and the local, some isolated, some richly syncretized with others, but none claiming exclusivity. It was easier to shoot at one target than many, and the one target was carefully painted in the most lurid possible colours, derived from cults selected for barbarity, not typicality. And after all, these so-called pagans would never have described themselves as pagans. But even if they didn't explicitly use this word, some historians have gone so far as to argue that there was a clear dividing line between pagans and Christians, and followers of traditional Roman religion did perceive a boundary between themselves and other religious practices. So how did the Romans draw that line between our religion and others? Well, to understand that, we have to take a look at what was happening 70 years earlier, during the persecution of the Christians. Before the word pagan came along, the word that the Romans used to describe their own spiritual practices was one we would very easily recognize today. They called it religio, which is where our word for religion comes from. This didn't just encompass the traditional Roman gods such as Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, but it also encompassed a range of traditional religions from other cultures that became part of the Roman Empire as its boundaries gradually expanded. The worship of foreign gods such as Isis, the Magna Mater, and Bacchus was gradually accepted into the Roman term religio, even though the flexibility of Roman religion was not without its limits. In the 2nd century BC, for example, the Senate suppressed the worship of the Greek god Dionysus because they suspected that it was encouraging the youth to participate in orgiastic secret rites. They often gave these practices that they disapproved of the name superstitio, which is where we get our word for superstition from. But again, there were no hard and fast rules about what superstitio was. It was simply a religious practice that was seen as weird, unacceptable, and potentially just ineffective or vain. That being said, generally speaking, even these superstitions were quite happily tolerated as long as they didn't cause major public disturbances. But all that was about to change in the 3rd century AD. In the year 250 AD, the Emperor Decius took the throne after a long period of political instability. He decreed that all citizens of the Roman Empire were required to make an animal sacrifice at a temple in a city near them. For the entire following year, every temple in every city of the Roman Empire was flooded with worshippers eager to demonstrate their loyalty to Rome by making an appropriate sacrifice to the gods. Really, any gods would do, so long as they were making a blood sacrifice, and that sacrifice was certified by a local magistrate. You actually had to have a physical certificate that showed that you had completed a sacrifice. Kind of like getting an I voted sticker, except it was more like, I slaughtered an animal for the good of Rome. Many Christians felt compelled to join in, some because they held prominent positions in the public service and feared their livelihood if they did not, others because they had friends and family who pressured and corralled them into joining, and others reluctantly conformed because they feared the punishment that would follow if they did not. Some very clever and enterprising Christians found a way to avoid sacrificing but also avoid penalty. They managed to forge certificates. Many Christians, however, did not cave to the pressure. The punishment for not sacrificing was death. Their deaths were violent, and it was deeply traumatizing for the early Christian community, to the point where this was the single most defining event in early Christian identity. So for many historians, this is the dividing line in the sand that they had been looking for. This was the first time in Roman history when all of the religions of the Roman Empire were very clearly placed on one side of a dividing line that separated them from Christianity. Even though they didn't call themselves pagans, they basically said, we are the religion and they are the superstition. And the act that separated them was animal sacrifice. In this way, sacrifice became, in the words of historian John North, an act of pagan profession. So in one sense, we could argue that this is when the idea of paganism, even if not the word paganism, was born. In fact, there are several prominent Roman historians who make this argument, including Mary Beard, along with her co-authors John North and Simon Price. But the problem with this idea of paganism was that it came entirely from the top down and not from the bottom up. In fact, this was the first time that the bureaucratic machinery of the Roman Empire was put to use in enforcing religious conformity. Officials who were once in charge of taking census records or tasked with collecting taxes or managing the grain supply were all of a sudden co-opted into the grand task of managing an empire-wide persecution. These officials were now watching over temples, making sure that people had sacrificed, and issuing certificates to guarantee that citizens had done their religious duty to the state. So this idea that we can put all pre-Christian religions into a bucket isn't completely without its historical precedent. It definitely existed. It wasn't just an invention of the Christians. But it did come from a Roman emperor and from a team of bureaucrats who were trying to put citizens into categories so that their religion could be controlled. But that doesn't mean that this category reflected the way that most Romans felt about their religious practice. And just because this legislation decided that animal sacrifice was the most important symbol of their loyalty to the Roman Empire, that doesn't mean that that's how ordinary citizens felt about their own religion. Non-Christian religious practices were extremely diverse, and animal sacrifice was only a very small part of some of those traditions. So it seems extremely reductionist to see these religions as being about sacrifice alone. This definition of paganism was also not readily accepted by Christians either. For them, it wasn't sufficient to be a good Christian to simply refrain from making animal sacrifices. Realistically, this also wasn't sufficient for many of the emperors who decided to make legislation banning aspects of what they called paganism in the years following the conversion of Constantine. We know that by the mid-4th century, animal sacrifice was banned, although there is some disagreement among scholars about when exactly this happened. Some argue that this happened in the year 341 under the Emperor Constans. Others argue that it was the Emperor Constantius II in the year 354 AD. And then others argued that it was the Emperor Theodosius in 380 AD. But this did not go nearly far enough for many Christians. In fact, for them, this was just the beginning. In the year 399, for example, the emperors Arcadius and Honorius ordered that the idols that were previously worshipped in temples be removed. And they also ordered that these temples no longer receive public funds. Now, that's not to say that these laws were necessarily effective. We have plenty of evidence that suggests that people continued to perform animal sacrifices, worship statues in temples, and attend festivities just as they previously did. However, it did mark the official transformation of the Roman state to a Christian state, and it showed an attempt to define what paganism meant, although it certainly didn't go as far as many Christians would have liked. So if the dividing line between paganism and Christianity wasn't merely animal sacrifice, then what was it? Well, in order to understand this, we need to take a look at the wealth of religious practices going on in the Roman Empire shortly after the triumph of Christianity through Christian eyes. Although he's best known today for his philosophical works, the 4th century bishop Augustine of Hippo was known in his own day as a bit of an agony aunt, dispensing practical advice to concerned Christians. One of his correspondents, Publicola, wrote to him deeply concerned that he was struggling to avoid pagan practices in his daily life. For a 4th century Christian, even a simple trip to the marketplace could be rife with spiritual pollution and contact with paganism. As they passed through the streets, they would have crossed paths with little statues of the pagan gods housed in small temples known as idicula, which populated many street corners in the ordinary Roman cityscape. It's possible that the air they breathed was filled with incense dedicated to those gods. If they were thirsty and they went to soothe their parched throats in the nearby stream, they may have been reminded by the lamps and offerings left nearby that many pagans venerated springs and wells as deities in their own right. The ocean himself was also a god, and he sired a whole brood of nymphs and demigods who populated the local waterways. Once they arrived at the market, they may have discovered to their dismay that the wine and grain had actually been offerings to thank the gods for the harvest. The meat for sale was also from acts of pagan sacrifice, despite the many attempts on the part of the Roman emperors to ban this practice. On their way home, the heavens opened up to a heavy rainfall, and a thunderclap courtesy of Jupiter himself. Try not to get caught in the rain, by the way. It may lead to unwanted pregnancy. What was a good Christian to do when the pagan gods were so deeply intertwined in the fabric of daily life? There were gods in the stars, gods for the days of the week and the signs of the zodiac. There were gods for weddings, gods for funerals, gods for war, gods for peace, gods in the air, gods in the sea, gods in the wine, gods in the sewers, gods in the kitchen, and gods in the bedroom. There were more gods than you could poke a stick at. And more importantly, there was a huge variety of ways that the community could worship that multitude of gods. Augustine was quick to reassure his correspondent Publicola. Since it was impossible to go about your everyday business without encountering some aspect of pagan practice, Christians could breathe incense-laced air and buy grain at the market and drink from streams that were full of offerings for pagan gods with a clean conscience. And even though animal sacrifice was one of the most taboo aspects of pagan ritual for Christians, as long as he wasn't 100% certain that the meat came from sacrifice, the Christian could go about his business and buy the meat without being too worried about ritual pollution. Augustine's writings reveal just how deeply embedded the old gods were in everyday life of the Roman Empire, even 80 years after the conversion of Constantine. Not only was there no clear legal definition of paganism apart from bans on worshipping statues and animal sacrifice, but every Christian bishop developed their own way of thinking about what was and wasn't acceptable conduct for a Christian. Now, part of what was so difficult is that pagans didn't have a single creed, founding mythology, or story that they could cite as something they definitively believe. Now, there are so many Christians who had a crack at defining paganism. I can't get into all of them, but personally for me, the one that I find most interesting and who I believe has been the most influential in subsequent years was Augustine of Hippo. What Augustine noticed is that many what he called pagan religions or pagan practices involved believing that the gods or the divine resided within nature itself. Activities that ranged from worshipping streams or worshipping rivers, all the way through to reading the stars in order to understand the future, in other words, astrology, all the way through to gods such as Dionysus being a representation of wine. All of this fundamentally boils down to the idea that the will of the gods and the actions of the gods can be divined through nature, and that nature is not just a reflection of the gods, nature is the gods. What he argued was quite radical. He argued that everything that humans are able to perceive on Earth through their bodily senses, everything that we can taste, touch, hear, smell, and see, is in fact not God, but God's creation. The true God was immutable, atemporal, and eternal. Therefore, anything that we may perceive in the natural world, plants, flowers, bodies of water, stars, are not God. Similarly, anything created by human hands could not be worshipped. Even though this seems like a very simple statement, this had profound implications at the time. This was a radical step towards what we might call the disenchantment of the world. Rather than seeing divinity as something that could potentially live in every street corner, that could live in the sky, that could live in the water that you drink, divinity became something that was quite remote. It was something we couldn't see, touch, or hear with our human senses. All of a sudden, we were living in a world that was a step removed from God. He can only be revealed through faith and through specific church-endorsed texts and rituals. While this definition was philosophically profound, it wasn't always easy to implement in practice. And it also wasn't comprehensive. It didn't cover every aspect of pagan religious practice. It doesn't really explain why animal sacrifice doesn't work, and it also doesn't explain the range of religious practices that were shared in common between pagans and Christians. And so what this did was it created something of a grey area between paganism and Christianity. Let's take a little bit of time to interrogate what we might call the grey zone. So even if you think you have a pretty clear idea of what paganism means, let me ask you to put that idea on ice for a little bit, because I'm about to give you a tour of what I'd like to call the grey zone between paganism and Christianity, as I see it and I've observed in academic literature about religion in the Roman Empire. Personally, I like to think of these in 4 broad categories, starting with number 1. Activities that were clearly in the service of a pagan god that Christians participated in. So just because somebody was baptized doesn't mean that they weren't also happy to join in celebrations that were openly worshipping a pagan god. This happened pretty early on when Constantine officially converted to Christianity, when his mother-in-law went to the town of Mama and discovered, much to her horror, that pagans, Christians, and Jews would celebrate holidays together. They would gather in the streets and dance and sing and worship all their various different gods at the same time. Now, this was pretty scandalous for this devout Christian woman, even in the 330s AD, even when a lot of the rules against paganism that happened in the late 4th century AD had not been implemented. Nevertheless, in the late 4th century, even when certain aspects of pagan practice were being banned, such as animal sacrifice and the worship of statues, there was actually a law issued by the emperors Arcadius and Honorius claiming that they didn't want to put a stop to the public enjoyment that was had from traditional Roman festivities. They declined to call these necessarily pagan, even though often pagan gods were involved. A really interesting example is the Brumalia, which is the festival celebrating Dionysus, which continued in the eastern half of the Roman Empire right up until the 12th century AD. So you could potentially argue that at a certain point in time, perhaps these festivals had actually been kind of Christianized or at least secularized, but ultimately they began their lives as a religious obligation as part of the worship of a pagan god. Then there is the second kind of grey area that I like to call the cut and replace. This was when you would take basically a ritual or an image that had previously involved a pagan god and simply chop out the god and put the Christian god in its place. One of my favorite examples is ancient Roman wedding portraits. While wedding photography didn't exist in the ancient Roman world, Roman couples had a particular way that they liked to be portrayed in the images created to celebrate the wedding. Often these images would be on signet rings or sometimes carved into tombstones or other carved monuments. Traditionally in Roman art, the real money shot was the moment when the bride and groom had their hands joined together by a woman who was kind of a celebrant, and she was kind of like a maid of honor called a pronuba. Now, in real life, this part of the ceremony would have been performed by a real person who was probably a family friend of the bride or the groom. But in art, this role was traditionally played by a god or goddess. So when early Christians wanted a wedding portrait done, they simply cut out the pagan god or goddess and pasted in Jesus. And there you go. Problem solved. The wedding is no longer pagan. Then category number 3 is the vast pool of images, rituals, and philosophical ideas that are shared between these two supposedly distinct religious traditions. For example, in the very early days of Christianity, often pagans and Christians would share burial spaces known as catacombs, which were dug underground, particularly in the city of Rome. And often these tombs would be decorated with symbols that were common to both religions. For example, vine leaves may represent the cult of Dionysus. However, Jesus also said, "I am the vine," and he turned water into wine. Finally, there's what we might call the secularization of traditional religion. In the year 399 AD, the emperors Arcadius and Honorius outlawed the worship of statues in temples. However, at the same time, they mandated that these statues and temples could not be destroyed without official imperial permission. What happened to many of these statues is that they eventually were moved into communal spaces such as bathhouses and marketplaces in order to allow them to be displayed in public without necessarily being worshipped. And they remained part of the community even when the community was predominantly Christian. The pagan gods also kept their names as the days of the week, in Romance languages in particular. So ultimately, there were lots of ways in which Christians continued to participate in pagan culture, even though they didn't see themselves as necessarily performing an act of worship. So how did this grey area emerge? It's almost impossible to provide a single definitive history because there are so many rituals, practices, and ideas that have their roots in pre-Christian practice. However, I'm going to use a specific case as illustrative of a larger phenomenon. So let's take a look at one of the most seemingly innocuous religious symbols, the flower. Step 1. Flowers in Roman religion. Flowers were everywhere in ancient Roman art. They're a typical decoration on columns, in frescoes, and on relief carvings such as tombstones and votive offerings. Flowers also played a special role in Rome's many religious rituals. Animals destined for sacrifice, for example, would often have their horns decorated with flowers. Some flowers also had specific meanings or associations with Roman mythology. For example, the god Narcissus was associated with the daffodil. Persephone was kidnapped by Hades at the moment when she was gathering flowers. There was also the goddess of spring herself, Flora, and the festival dedicated to her known as the Floralia. So even though flowers could be used in a context that might seem more religious to us, such as during religious parades, festivals, and sacrifices, and they could also be used in settings that might seem more secular to us, such as in houses, in baths, in tombs, and other forms of decoration, the Romans didn't necessarily draw a line between these two things. In fact, there are some scholars that argue that the idea of the secular didn't really emerge until the 4th century AD, kind of in response to this very question. So if you ask me, I think the entire world had religious meanings woven into it, at least through Roman eyes. And nothing was untouched, including the trees and the flowers themselves. And many early Christians would have seen it the same way. Step 2. Flowers in early Christian art. From the time of Jesus' death to around 200 AD, there is no art that we can reliably identify as distinctively Christian. Previously, art historians assumed that for the first 2 centuries, Christians had no art that was distinctively their own. Some went so far as to argue that Christians rejected the use of iconography in religious practice. But more recent historians have challenged this. Art historian Robin Jensen has argued that early Christians probably used the same artistic motifs and conventions as non-Christians for these first 2 centuries. The first early Christian art started to emerge in the 3rd century AD, and some of the most prominent examples are the catacombs of ancient Rome. These were underground burial spaces which could sometimes be exclusively Christian or could sometimes be shared between both pagans and Christians. These tombs were often decorated in fresco paintings and used carvings which had Christian symbols in them. These symbols, however, were not entirely original. Many of them were derived from the traditional ancient Roman artistic repertoire. This would involve 3 main things. First of all, there were pagan myths and mythological themes. Second, there were what we might call neutral images, such as flowers. But as I said, there's really no separation between the sacred and the secular in ancient Roman art or religion. And then finally, you could have illustrations of Bible stories alongside these 2 other things. So Christians were just as deeply immersed in Roman artistic traditions as the so-called pagans. This incredible example comes from the Roman catacomb of Domitilla. It shows Cupid and Psyche gathering flowers together. Cupid on the one hand represents love, Eros, and Psyche on the other hand represents the soul. So it's possible that even though these 2 figures are pagan gods, in the Christian context, they may have a double meaning. In the myth of Cupid and Psyche, the god Cupid, son of Venus, falls in love with a mortal princess. She is the most beautiful of all the mortals, and he comes to her in invisible form. She is not allowed to see him in his true form because humans cannot process the gods in their raw, unfiltered form. So they must either wear a disguise or appear as mere air. However, Psyche is too curious. She wants to know what this mystery lover who has swept her off her feet into his gorgeous castle looks like. So she waits for him, and in the morning she discovers what he looks like. For this, she must be punished because no mortal can see the gods in their raw form. So she undergoes a series of fairly sadistic trials at the hands of Cupid's mother, Venus, and she comes out the other side as an immortal goddess. Now, why would a Christian be drawn to this particular myth? Well, some have argued that rather than taking this myth as the literal truth, it's taken as a symbol of the idea of immortality that comes after life. In the case of Psyche, she undergoes a series of trials and dies a spiritual death at the hands of Venus, before being reborn as an immortal goddess. So literally, it's a story about the immortality of the soul. And here, love and the soul are shown frolicking in a field together, picking flowers. Another connection you might notice is that Persephone was picking flowers before she was kidnapped and taken into the underworld, where she reigns as the queen there forever. Another symbol of the eternity of the cycle of life and death. So rather than looking at these images and being like, oh yeah, that's a pagan god in a Christian space, or even saying these must be pagans in a Christian space, it seems more likely that the answer is somewhere in the middle, or basically the terms pagan and Christian are no longer helpful to help us describe what's going on here. So it's possible that this simple painting of 2 creatures gathering flowers actually had a pretty profound philosophical meaning that combined both traditional Greek and Roman mythology with Christian ideas about the afterlife. You could even argue that Christians were using pagan mythology and imagery to express Christian ideas. So from the very beginning, it seems that Christians shared certain iconographic and artistic traditions with non-Christians. But does that mean that these images are pagan? Well, I don't necessarily think so. Even if we ignore the presence of figures who are obviously considered pagan gods, such as Cupid and Psyche, the image of the flowers themselves wasn't necessarily neutral. And to explain what I mean by that, let's have a look at a 3rd century Christian bishop who was on a one-man crusade against the flower. So let's think back to those 3rd century AD Christians who had recently been traumatized by the Decian persecution. In other words, they were forced to perform animal sacrifice or risk death. One thing I didn't mention is that often it was mandatory to wear floral garlands on your head and around your body during these sacrifices, not to mention to decorate the animal to be sacrificed. So obviously for some Christians, the idea of flowers and the floral garland itself was quite traumatizing. And this trauma left a lasting scar on certain Christians. There was one 3rd century bishop called Tertullian who believed that flowers, no matter how innocent they may appear on the surface, were the work of the devil. And no, I don't just mean flowers lying around in nature on the ground. He was okay with those flowers. But he deeply objected to the practice of picking flowers and using them to decorate things. Worst of all, to decorate humans. First of all, he claimed that flower crowns went against nature. That's right, take that, Coachella influences circa 2014. So then he goes to argue that because so many pagan gods have this tradition of wearing different flower garlands, for example, the cult of Dionysus involves wearing a crown of vine leaves or of ivy, and several other pagan gods have their own special flower or leaf. He argues that this must be the work of demons who are compelling humans to give the idols the good stuff, the thing they like. And if flowers are what the idols want and what the demons want, then we shouldn't give it to them. Now, unsurprisingly, this tirade didn't convince a lot of people. Now, there certainly were some quite radical Christian couples who were prepared to avoid traditions like using flowers as decorations on their wedding day or wearing flower crowns as part of the wedding ceremony. But at the end of the day, most Christians still enjoyed flowers, not just in the earth, but also as decorations. And they didn't really see a compelling reason to change their behaviour. Now, this could potentially be a bit of a pickle for certain Christian bishops and leaders at the time. On the one hand, do you condemn this mostly harmless and very popular thing? Or on the other hand, do you consciously avoid it because you don't want to be perceived as pagan? Well, there was one bishop who found a really ingenious solution to this. The solution was a bit of creative reframing and marketing on the part of 4th century bishop John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople. He simply claimed that the flower had a completely new, symbolic Christian meaning. He encouraged young couples to wear them at their weddings as a symbol of their victory over sexual temptation. Now, not exclusively because of the work of John Chrysostom, but because of the attitudes of many Christians in this period, flowers became a fairly normalized and accepted part of Christian practice, both at funerals and during feast days and other general celebrations. But that doesn't mean that flowers were off the hook forever. So let's fast forward 1,000 years to 15th century England on the eve of the Reformation. The Catholic Church was still flourishing and made up an integral lives of the ordinary people of England. Flowers also had a special place in church festivities, such as during the Feast of Easter when eggs and flowers were used as symbols of new life, or on Palm Sunday when branches full of flowers would be blessed by a priest and carried in a large parade to a special shrine. But this was not to last. During the Reformation, Protestants started to attack aspects of Catholic worship that they deemed to be pagan. This could often simply be things that were deemed too ornamental or things that were seen as too close to the worship of nature, and flowers fell very dangerously at the intersection of those two things. Critics of the Catholic Church, such as Luther and Calvin, were very sensitive to the idea that early Christian doctrine had been polluted through the influence of Hellenizing non-Christians. This included everything from saints to holidays to sacraments to church vestments and other ceremonials. Protestants didn't just object to the use of images, although they definitely objected to that, but they also objected to folk traditions that had made their way into church festivities and ceremonials, such as the maypole, and even to the flowers that decorated the maypole itself. Rather than seeing flowers as an innocent and neutral tradition, the Protestants started to see flowers as connected to ancient Roman paganism, especially to the goddess Flora, whom they labelled a meretrix, which is Latin for prostitute. Our 3rd century anti-floral crusader Tertullian even got a small revival in the works of some English Protestants who specifically criticised aspects of the English ritual calendar which he believed were connected to paganism. In this way, Protestants used their knowledge of early church history and ancient Roman traditions in order to reform the church of their own day. Even though Christianity originally defined paganism through its devotion to animal sacrifice and idol worship, by the time we get into the Reformation, this definition really had no place. The banning of paganism was an enterprise without end. The word paganism became like an autoimmune disorder within the body of Christianity itself, indiscriminately attacking both native and foreign elements within. And one of the challenges for historians is that the Reformers managed to label these practices as pagan so convincingly that many historians have chosen to do the same, framing medieval Catholicism as a vulgar and semi-pagan form of Christianity. So using the word pagan comes with innate dangers. It forces us to see the entire world, and particularly to see our own world and our practices, through the lens of a small group of people who have been labeling religious practices in order to control them. So even though this seems like a rather small example, the flower controversy illustrates just how difficult it is to draw the line between paganism and Christianity, and how at no point in Christian history has there ever been a firm consensus on where that line should be drawn. Now, not every example is going to fit this pattern, so I want to hear from you and hear what you want to know about. What are some traditions, images, or ideas that come from Christianity, or perhaps just come from your everyday life, that you think might have their origins in paganism that you want to know about? But even though there are so many individual cases, I think in order to explore them properly, what we need to do is agree on a certain set of shared vocabulary that we can use to adequately describe them. So that brings me back to the original question of the video. Should we use the word paganism to describe some of the traditions we still have today that clearly have roots going back well before Christianity? Well, if you ask me, it really depends on what we are using the word for and what actual work we are getting that word to do. I'm not a huge believer in banning words from my vocabulary in general, as long as they have an actual use. But I will say, in the case of paganism, I don't think it's the best word to use. Because once we get past these really clear dividing lines, like it's quite easy to say that a god is pagan, or even that a temple was pagan, or you could perhaps say that animal sacrifice is pagan, because that's clearly how it's been defined in this kind of 3rd and 4th century debate, which gave rise to the word. But once you get past that territory, it's increasingly difficult to tell the difference between what is paganism and what is Christianity. And ultimately, there was never any firm consensus reached on this topic. I think putting these practices in the category of pagan can be really unhelpful, and this is why. For one thing, I think the entire practice of putting a label on different religions is flawed. I would say it's actually more relevant in the context of a religion like Christianity, where it is self-consciously centralized. There have been many attempts to make a centralized Christian religious creed and an agreed set of authoritative religious texts. There are certain sacraments and practices that delineate who is and isn't Christian, but even then, the boundaries aren't perfectly set in stone. For the pre-Christian religions of Rome, Greece, and the many other nations that are casually called pagan, just because there were some imperial bureaucrats who tried to stamp them with a label 2,000 years ago, doesn't mean that that's how people every day thought about what they were doing. So I think we need to be quite skeptical of these words because ultimately they are a tool for control. That is exactly why they're so controversial today. So for historians, I think the word paganism only has a very limited usage. So this holiday season, when you hear that Christmas comes from a pagan festival, you can always just ask, what is paganism? Or you could even ask, what is truth? And whoever you're talking to will definitely take it well and not punch you in the face. I promise. In all seriousness though, I understand that it's much more satisfying to say paganism than it is to talk about traditional Roman religion or polytheism or any of those other awkward circumlocutions that we have developed to talk about this. I also appreciate that the internet atheists will have a much harder time making memes about Christians being pagan. But we gain so much when we lose the word paganism. Not only can we free ourselves from the stereotypes of human sacrifice, campfire dancing, and orgies, but we can also start to discover a far more interesting story. It's the story of how Christians extended and built upon the traditions of ancient Rome. It's a story of how Christians adapted the traditions and symbols around them from multiple faiths and cultures to articulate Christian ideas. And it's the story of how the philosophy and thought of the distant past keeps coming back into our traditions today. Finally, it's the story of the never-ending quest for purity in church traditions and how that irrevocably divided the church from within. So while it would be too simplistic to say that cherubs, flowers, sacred springs, holy wine, and maypoles are pagan, we can still investigate the pre-Christian history of these traditions and their profound influence today. And I certainly plan to. So on that note, happy holidays. For Christmas this year, I would like you to leave your best story about pagan traditions and how they have survived today in the comments section below. Please give generously.